They told me it was harmless, just a test. Nothing dangerous, nothing permanent, just a few hours of my time in exchange for helping my country. I remember the room, bright lights, too bright, white walls that didn't feel clean, just empty. They handed me a mask, told me to wait for instructions. So I did, because that's what you do, right? You trust them. At first, nothing happened, just the hum of the room, the sound of my own breathing inside the mask. In, out, in, and then something fell off. My hands didn't feel like mine anymore. My thoughts started slipping, like trying to hold on to something underwater. I remember trying to speak, but I couldn't tell if my words were leaving my mouth or just echoing in my head. They were watching, taking notes. Like this was normal. Like I was the experiment and not a person. They told me it was safe, but they never told me what safe meant. Thousands of soldiers volunteered. Young, healthy, trusting, and almost none of them were told the full truth. What happened in those rooms didn't stay there. For some, it followed them home, lived in their bodies, their minds, for years, for decades. Because sometimes the scariest things aren't experiments gone wrong. They're the ones that went exactly as planned. Tonight, we're going to Edgewood. Welcome back to Hexes, Haunts, and Howls. I'm your host, Cupcake. Today is episode 7 of Stars, Stripes, and Secrets, a series where we dive into leaked government documents and classified mysteries. To understand what happened, we need to go back. Back to a quiet stretch of land along the Chesapeake Bay, to a place called Edgewood Arsenal. On the surface, it didn't look like much. Just another military installation. Low buildings, clean lines, orderly roads. Nothing about it would make you stop and question what was happening inside. Because that was the point. It felt official, controlled, safe. Inside the buildings were clinical. White walls, sterile equipment, rooms designed for precision. The kind of place where everything had a purpose. Where nothing was left to chance. At least, that's how it appeared. This was the late 1950s. The world was still reeling from the aftermath of World War II. But instead of peace, a new kind of tension was settling in. The Cold War. A quiet, constant standoff between global power. Not fought on traditional battlefields, but through threats, technology, and fear. Because the next war, if it came, was expected to look very different. Not bullets, not bombs, but chemicals. Invisible agents that could shut down the human body in seconds. Gases you couldn't see, couldn't smell, until it was too late. And that fear, it drove research. It drove urgency. It drove places like Edgewood to become something more than just a military base. Under the oversight of the U.S. Department of Defense, scientists and military officials began asking a question. If these weapons were ever used against us, how would the human body respond? How long could a soldier function? How much exposure was too much? On paper, it was about defense, understanding the threat so that they could protect against it. But in practice, that line between protection and experimentation started to blur. Because to understand what these chemicals could do, you needed test subjects. And at Edgewood, they found them. The people who walked through Edgewood's gates weren't criminals. They weren't volunteers for fame or glory. They were young soldiers, mostly in their late teens, early 20s, fresh from training, full of discipline, and full of trust. They signed up willingly, told they were helping their country. They were told it would be routine, safe, temporary. Testing protective equipment, they said. Short exposures, nothing harmful. On the surface, it sounded almost mundane. A checkbox on a long list of military duties. A brief diversion from drills and inspections. For many of them, volunteering was a point of pride, a chance to serve beyond the normal call, to be a part of something important. But the pride came with a hidden cost. What they weren't told was that protective equipment wasn't the only thing being tested, that their bodies would be exposed to substances most of the world had only read about in intelligence reports or classified memos, that their minds too could be altered in ways no one had fully studied. Imagine being one of them. You're 20 years old. You've spent your life following orders, trusting people in charge. You show up for your assignment, in your uniform, expecting routine. And instead, you're handed a mask, a vial, and a set of instructions that seem innocent enough. You glance around the room and see others like you, volunteers, eager, nervous, and ready. Some joke to ease the tension. Some don't speak at all, staring at the floor, trying not to think too hard. The scientists are calm, professional. They explain each step. Everything is presented as normal procedure. You don't yet know what's real. You don't yet know what they won't tell you. That contrast between trust and betrayal would define Edgewood. The soldiers who walked in believing they were part of a controlled experiment were about to become the experiment themselves. Because at Edgewood, the line between volunteer and subject was thinner than anyone could imagine. And for most of them, that line would blur completely before the first test even began. The first test seemed simple. A room, a mask, a single chemical agent, all explained in calm, professional terms. At first, it felt routine, just another checkbox in their military training. Soldiers lined up, donned their masks, and followed instructions carefully. But then, the substances began to work. Not every chemical was deadly. Not every test was violent in its effect. Some were designed to incapacitate, slowly, quietly, making the mind and body falter in ways that were hard to describe. Others were nerve agents, powerful, invisible, and merciless. The rooms themselves were clinical, yes, but clinical doesn't mean safe. Gas chambers, sealed in white, stripped the world down to its barest elements. You could hear the hum of the equipment, the faint hiss of the air systems. A mask drill could turn ordinary breathing into panic. An infection, seemingly routine, could leave your limbs trembling as though they didn't belong to you. And that's when the soldiers began to notice something, a shift, a disorientation that didn't fade, a panic that rose from nowhere, filling their chest, their throat, and their mind. Some reported hallucinations, faces in the walls, shadows moving where no one was standing, thoughts looping in impossible ways, words coming out wrong, actions delayed, sluggish, impossible to control. It wasn't supposed to feel like this. The test was supposed to be controlled, measured, safe. But every new substance, every new exposure, carried a creeping uncertainty. Eyes that were supposed to follow instructions now darted searching. Hands that were supposed to be steady with equipment now shook. Brains that were supposed to process simple commands now tripped over their own synapses. The calm professionalism of the lab faded. The sense of order cracked. Because even in a place designed to protect, the human body could react in ways no one can fully anticipate. And the soldiers, volunteers, trusted participants felt that firsthand. They realized slowly maybe the assurances weren't the full truth. Maybe the tests weren't just routine. Maybe something had gone wrong. Or maybe, just maybe, everything was going exactly as planned. The chemicals didn't just affect the body, they seeped into the mind. At first, it was subtle, a hesitation, a misstep, a memory that didn't quite line up. Then it grew. A soldier would sit in a chair, supposed to follow simple instructions, and suddenly the world around him would feel wrong. The walls breathing, shadows stretching in impossible shapes, voices echoing just beyond comprehension, things moving where no one was standing. Hands didn't obey, feet didn't follow orders, eyes would track nothing. The mind scrambled to make sense of chaos it didn't understand. Some describe being trapped inside their own body, watching themselves move as if through somebody else's eyes, knowing they should act, should respond, but unable to force even a finger to obey. Identity began to unravel. Who am I? Who is controlling me? What is real? Hallucinations bled into reality. A sound in the corner became a figure. A whisper in the silence became a command. Time itself seemed to stretch and warp. Minutes felt like hours. Hours collapsed into seconds. Some soldiers reported seeing themselves twice. One in the room, one inside their mind, observing, judging, and panicking. And still, the tests continued. The supervisors remained calm, professional, making notes, recording reactions, ticking boxes, as though the horror wasn't happening at all. But for the soldiers, it was impossible to ignore. Because when the body stops listening and the mind begins to betray itself, control is gone. Fear becomes a constant companion. Reality itself becomes a question. And for some, the question never went away. Who am I when my thoughts aren't my own? Who am I when my body doesn't respond? And who, if anyone, decides what is real? The chemical, the gas, the injection. It didn't just test human endurance, it tested the very edges of sanity. And when the soldier finally left the room, they carried more than the physical side effects. They carried the experience itself, etched into their mind. A reminder of how fragile perception really is. Because at Edgewood, sometimes the most terrifying experiments weren't the ones you could see. They were the ones that lived inside your head. When the tests ended, the soldiers were sent home, not celebrated, not even debriefed, just released, as if stepping out the door would erase everything that had happened inside those walls. Some carried faint bruises, some carried nausea, headaches, trembling hands, but the invisible weight, the thing that lingered in the mind, was harder to shake. They were given no clear explanation, no guidance on what to expect, no warning about what might come next. Doctors said nothing. Officers said nothing. The government said nothing. And so the soldiers returned to their lives, confused. Why do I feel this way? Why can't I focus? Why do sounds and shadows still feel alive around me? Some struggled to sleep. Others began to experience neurological symptoms, memory loss, tremors, and muscle weakness. Some developed chronic illnesses that doctors couldn't explain. And for many, mental health became an ongoing battle. Anxiety, depression, panic attacks. All reminders that the experiment didn't end when the test ended. They tried to carry on jobs, families, normal routines. But the shadow of Edgewood followed them quietly, persistently. Every memory of their rooms, the masks, the injections, the chemicals, hung just beneath the surface. A low hum, like the lab itself had seeped into their minds. Frustration grew, not at the soldiers themselves, but at the world, at the system that had sent them there, then ignored them. The fear didn't scream, it whispered, a quiet, constant reminder that something had been taken, something they might never recover. And for decades, that was the story, one of silence, of confusion, of lives altered quietly, invisibly, by an experiment the world didn't want to see. Because some lessons at Edgewood weren't taught in classrooms. They were learned the hard way, in the body, in the mind, in the very soul. After Edgewood, many soldiers tried to speak. They reached out to doctors, to commanding officers, to anyone who might explain the lingering effects, the headaches, the tremors, the nightmares that wouldn't fade. But time and time again, they were met with silence, or worse, dismissal. It's nothing, just part of military life. Your symptoms aren't connected to the tests. Bureaucracy became a wall. Red tape became a shield behind which the truth could hide. Letters went unanswered. Claims were lost in filing cabinets. Memories faded while paperwork stacked up. Years passed, then decades, and through it all, the soldiers, the volunteers, the subjects were left to wonder if anyone would ever acknowledge what had been done to them. They weren't asking for fame. They weren't asking for money. They were asking for the truth, for recognition. But the system didn't move quickly. It didn't move at all. And this silence wasn't just absence. It was intentional. A quiet erasure of the very people who had given themselves to science and to their country. Some veterans gave up, living with the pain and confusion quietly in their own homes. Others fought for decades, determined to hold someone accountable, to force the world to see what had happened. But the truth was buried beneath layers of official reports, classified documents, and government denials. A story that should have been public, acknowledged, and addressed remained hidden. Time passed, and the world moved on. But for those people who had been inside Edgewood's labs, nothing moved forward. Their bodies still carried the chemicals. Their minds still carried the memories. And the sense of being forgotten, ignored, it never left. Because sometimes the most terrifying thing isn't what's done to you in a room. It's what happens when the world refuses to see it. Decades passed. The veterans' voices, once dismissed, could no longer be ignored. Questions that had been buried in files, ignored in offices, and denied in polite meetings began to resurface. Investigators, journalists, and historians started digging. Documents that had been locked away, classified, redacted, hidden from the public, slowly began to emerge. The truth was undeniable. The U.S. Department of Defense confirmed what many had feared for years. Yes, experiments had been conducted. Yes, thousands of soldiers had been exposed to chemical and biological agents. Yes, long-term effects had been real, documented, and for decades ignored. This wasn't a story of rumor or conspiracy. It was reality, filed in official reports, memos, and declassified documents, legally acknowledged. For the first time, the nation had to face what had been done in its name. Some veterans felt relief, validation that what they remembered was true, that their experiences were real, that they weren't just imagining these tremors, the hallucinations, the lingering illnesses, but relief was tempered with frustration, because acknowledgement came too late for many. For decades, their pain had been minimized, their lives quietly altered, their trust broken. Even partial acknowledgement couldn't erase the years of denial. It couldn't undo the damage done in those clinical rooms. It couldn't bring back the time lost to confusion, fear, and uncertainty. And yet the revelation was necessary. To see the truth is to confront it. To acknowledge it is to honor those who endured it. Edgewood was no longer just a memory. It was history. Documented, confirmed, and real. The horror was not fiction. It had happened, and it had been done in plain sight by the very people entrusted to protect those who served. When we look back at Edgewood, it's easy to see it as a story of science and war. But it's more than that. It's a story about trust and what happens when that trust is broken. What does it mean to volunteer? To give consent? When a young soldier walks into a room, told the test is harmless, is that true consent? Or is that something else entirely? Edgewood forces us to ask these questions. Because on paper, the experiments were designed for protection, to understand threats, to defend the country. But on the ground, the line between protection and exploitation disappeared. The people who participated weren't abstract data points. They were human beings. And human beings have limits. Limits of mind, of body, and of understanding. We're left asking, how much can we justify in the name of safety? How far can we push before the cost becomes something we can't accept? How do we reconcile the intention to protect with the reality of what was done? These are not easy questions. They don't have neat answers. They linger, heavy and uncomfortable, reminding us that morality isn't always clear, and that history often carries the echoes of what was ignored, dismissed, or denied. Edgewood isn't just about chemicals or experiments. It's about choices. And the consequences of those choices that can ripple through decades, affecting lives long after the doors are closed. All stories shared here, real or reported, remind us of the unseen, the overlooked, and the truths that linger long after the moment has passed. Have you experienced something strange, unexplainable, or haunting? I want to hear it. You can submit your stories to hexes, haunts, and howls at gmail.com. Again, that's hexes, haunts, and howls, all one word, at gmail.com. All stories will remain anonymous. You can also find us on all streaming platforms, including Apple Podcast, Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, and Instagram. Thank you for listening to Hexes, Haunts, and Towels. I'm your host, Cupcake. Until next time, stay sweet.